And I just have a comment. During the Obama administration, the FCC...
Net neutrality. Not enough videos have been made about this for some fucking reason. There's only 1 million. Even PewDiePie has done this little video. Oh my god. But what can really be said about net neutrality that hasn't been said before? Well, with the recent passing of a certain piece of legislation by a 1-vote majority last Friday night, I think it's become more apparent that with this extreme divide in America, it has become more and more important that people are informed about what the fuck is actually happening in legislation news, so that they can make informed decisions when it comes to elections like the fucking 2018 midterms. So, what is net neutrality? Let's get into that basic definitions real quick, so I can provide you a little bit of background information before we actually delve into the, how would I say, ISPs and FCCs with workarounds in these areas. So, as you can see, hello, Facecam. First time I've done this, actually. Not really, I've done this before, but in different settings. I'm not showing the top of my face because I want a little bit of privacy, a little bit of moxie, a little bit of mysterious, a little bit of safety, so you guys don't raid me. Try to fucking trace my ISP and get me in here, yes. But basic definition. Everyone loves using Google for their definitions, and everyone loves using that in the skeptic community. But what net neutrality is that it's basically the principle that internet service providers should enable all access to all contents and all applications, regardless of the source and without favoring or blocking particular websites or products. So say if Comcast had their own little feud with CNN or Fox News, they couldn't say, hey, fuck you, you're not getting anything. They really can't do that with the current rules, at least not without getting fined or at least somewhat socially ostracized. But it's also important to know the current, how would I say, favorability or supportiveness of some net neutrality legislation in America it is right now. So I found a little poll right here, and as you can see, the last question here is delving about support for net neutrality, and we have roughly about 61% in favor, 18% opposed, and then 21% in the unknown category. So let's give a little bit more information and context out there for those who may be unawares or who may be opposed to this for some reason, because I've been seeing a lot more, how would I say, anti-net neutrality recently, especially on videos like Linus Tech Tips when they delved into that. I'm not sure where this is. Usually the internet's quite supportive of it, so very new to me, so we're all learning new things today. But the FCC, or the Federal Communications Committee, which is currently headed by Xi Jinping, a Trump administration appointee from the Obama era, and basically what he wants to do is that he wants to reclassify SCC, or rather I should say not classify themselves, but the FCC wants to reclassify ISPs as a information provider as to pose a utility. And what this does is that it basically gives them the right to discriminate information, or rather it basically gets rid of the concept of net neutrality. So like I said back in that example where Comcast could block information to Fox News or CNN, this, if they repeal net neutrality, they could basically do that. But there's also an interesting line of reasoning that comes with repealing net neutrality, and the fact that it's a regulation seems to be a big point of contention for a lot of people. Now, it being a piece of regulation, it would follow traditional conservative logic that regulation would somehow inherently hamper growth, and as Xi Jinping, I believe, at some point in this article, said that this was a point of contention, and they did want to repeal net neutrality based on this. And there's also a bunch of other rules going into that as well. So, in that sense, does net neutrality, in fact, actually reduce income to the point where ISPs can no longer invest in these low-income areas or rural areas? Well, a big point you would have to understand is that maybe their profit margins are too low. Maybe they're not making enough money to actually do these investments out into other areas. So there's a couple of interesting things Telecommunications Act, which is where a lot of this net neutrality rules come from, it actually gave ISPs a huge tax break to actually improve infrastructure to these rural and poor areas. And they've actually made quite a bit of money off it. So I understand this is a HuffPo post. Come down there. It is just a Huffington Post, just for the information about the money they're giving here and not being a liberal biased here. But basically, what ISPs would do is that they would theoretically take money from the government to improve infrastructure, to install things like copper or fiber optic wire, whatever they chose to do. And so far, they've earned potentially up to $400 billion through this method, although I have seen estimates close to $600 billion, but I can't find that article, so take that with a grain of salt. But back then, during the 1990s, there was a lot more ISP options. Now there is quite a lot less due to mergers and acquisitions. So this $400 billion has allowed a lot of consolidation and a lot of, I would say, higher-ups getting better pay. But that's just blank money. That doesn't really suggest that there's a huge hamperance in growth or anything. Was also a interesting thing if you've been keeping up with, I would say, Time Warner. Time Warner has recently tried to actually acquire AT&T, which is very interesting in the sense that I think a couple of years ago, Time Warner was actually acquiring, I believe, Charter Communications, another ISP, and I believe he actually did get that, because I do have an article on here that was talking about a little weird litigation in that. But in order for a company to really acquire another company, especially considering AT&T and Time Warner are basically one of the main front runners on internet providing throughout the US, you need a lot of capital, a lot of excess capital to actually make something like this occur. Otherwise, you wouldn't really be able to convince people to really sell their company to you or to merge and reduce their autonomy. That requires a little bit of monetary persuasion. And really, the only way they could have this monetary persuasion is if they had the high enough, I would say, banks, if they had the deep enough pockets to actually do this. So really, Ajit's probably claim that this is kind of squelching investment really doesn't seem to make sense, because their profit margins are so high to the point where it seems they can invest in anything and they would still have profits. So I'm not really sure what Ajit Pai is really going on about here. But that's just, well, one thing, and that's really kind of a secondary way of looking at it, as I couldn't really find exact numbers on profits and, I would say, risk, I would say, assessments of certain areas. So take that with a grain of salt. But like I said, if they have enough money to merge into these massive corporations, they gotta have the capital to do it. And the only way they can have the capital to do it is if they're making an ass load of money on this. But going on to this, we also have a couple of interesting things to note about the FCC's bias towards telecom or information providers. And this makes sense considering it's currently the board of the FCC, which is comprised of 5 members, 3 of them Republican, 2 of them Democrat. So they would essentially be heavily favored towards telecoms right now. And they've done quite a few things to actually benefit them, or rather have proposed to do things like that, because effectiveness has really not been a strong point of this administration so far. Different topic entirely. But what has happened, or rather I should say what has been proposed, is that the FCC has tried to actually reclassify broadband speeds, or what would be traditionally called like high-speed internet, from 25 to 10 megabytes per second. And if you don't know what that 10 megabytes per second is significant, that's actually referencing cell tower service. So the average cell tower is actually able to pump out about 10 megabytes per second to your phone, depending on the weather. There's the theoretical max and account for things like weather changes and how many people are connected to the cell tower and stuff like that. But with this, information providers would basically be able to say, hey, this cell tower is providing you 10 megabytes per second. That's broadband internet. Do you want that shit? And I think most Americans would be a little bit skeptical, saying, well, copper wire is a little bit more, I don't know, secure, doesn't vary a whole bunch with weather. I mean, there's a little bit of light of a gust wind outside, I probably should be able to keep my internet. It's a little bit more stable if I have Wire 2, and there's just a myriad of benefits. And really what this suggests is that ISPs would really lower their quality, because instead of providing more broadband to rural and, you know, just average areas with actual physical lines, they would instead just put up one cell tower and be like, oh, okay, here 10,000 people use this cell tower, it provides you broadband access. Totally won't slow down and create a unmanageable shit show. But this is just one piece of legislation that Ajit Pai's FCC has tried to actually pass. There's also been a couple of other interesting things. Now, actually going back to the Time Warner Charter merger, I believe this was in 2014, if I remember correctly. And what this basically did is that Time Warner and Charter, when they actually merged into a whole big-ass company, what they ended up having to do was actually provide internet access to more areas out in areas where there was no ISP to begin with, and in areas where there was an ISP. So one to actually compete with the other. The issue is that ISPs are very opposed to, I would say, legislation that forces them to be somewhat competitive, like what Charter had to do. So what the FCC actually bargained with the ISPs is that they kind of, I would say, reduced, or I think they even got rid of the requirement for Charter to actually go into areas with those other ISPs. Instead, they just expanded out into areas where ISPs did not begin with. So the ISP that they're not competing with could theoretically maintain more dominance in the market and demand higher prices for lower quality. Because the thing is that when you have competition, you generally have an increase in internet speeds and quality and stability and, you know, customer service and all of that shenanigans, while reducing price. I mean, that's just typical jargon about, I would say, competitive nature, except that when ISPs are given the option, when they're given the influence, they will choose the route that will provide them with more income, even if that gives the consumers less options and less speeds. And actually, talking about options, I actually have a very interesting statistic here. Now, if you look at this graph, these varying degrees of purple indicate, or rather I should say blue, indicate the level of providers. So dark blue is 0, this is 1, this is 2. And as you can see, the vast majority of Americans have 1 or 2 competitors in their local regions. So say if I was to try to get internet access to my house right now, I would have to maybe consult Xfinity and maybe Charter Communications. I believe those are the 2 options around here. I can choose those 2. The issue is that go back to situations like this where they are not competitive with each other. You would basically have a situation where you would likely not get any good internet speeds here. I mean, as you can see here, quite a few Americans have a lot less choices when it comes to 100 megabytes and even 25 megabytes. So as you can imagine, there's very few people who offer these high-speed services that are necessary for modern businesses. So what this allows ISPs to do, assuming they have this monopolistic or duopolistic market, they can basically charge fairly high prices and just copy the schemes from their competitor, and they really kind of just do this weird thing where they mix each other out like that. So if they do that, the average consumer generally sees a very low quality internet with high prices, and as you can imagine, that is not very good. I probably don't need to go into great detail about how that is not good for the average consumer, and not to mention the fact that this really reduces the, I would say, incentive for ISPs to really be on the ball in maintaining their quality of internet. So I mean, hell, in my area, I believe, like I said, I said there was 2 options. I consulted one of them, and it turns out they don't offer service in my area. So I actually only have 1 option here, which is kind of asinine, considering this area has a lot of money. But even then, I check on the speed test regularly, and I noticed that for my 60 megabytes per second, I regularly get like maybe 20 download, and hardly get any upload. For the longest time, and if you have watched my streams, you know that I had many issues with actually trying to maintain a solid connection to Twitch, YouTube, and Mixer. It has been a nightmare for the most part, and I can't imagine what this is like for areas where it's a heavily congested, or in areas where it's rural entirely, where the only option you have is satellite internet, which don't need to go into detail about how that is screwy. But all this information is really just to give you an idea of the FCC's current bias towards ISPs, and really how ISPs have been fairly competitive, but that really doesn't show the full extent of really how they go. Oh, and yes, and here's another beautiful article here. This, if you don't know, Google has been trying to implement Google Fiber out into certain cities where they can. And what happens is that when a Google, I would say, car comes by to try to lay down fiber optic wires, they would generally have to go to the ISP and ask them to bring out a truck to help them lay it down, because of, you know, how that works and how the whole process of laying wire down. The issue is that process is very slow and time consuming. So I think they mentioned it somewhere in here. It took like 6 months or so on average for a company car to come out and help Google install these wires, because of how weird legislations work. Instead of just having a confirmed contractor go in there and do it within a month, Google will have to wait fucking months on end to actually do this, to the point where I don't have any articles for this, so take it with a grain of salt, but Google has had to start doing things like offering high-speed Wi-Fi as an alternative. So in areas where they can actually get a Google Fiber connection, they would then transmit that through a fast Wi-Fi solution from, top of the roof to other, and actually beam that down. So this is usually only a city slicker thing, but may have some application in suburban areas, although I wouldn't put your breath on that. But this is a city thing, and they would just have this little satellite that would beam internet across the other satellites, and that was just a way for them to actually go around this issue. But even then, that usually degrades the quality of the internet itself still, as well as just, how would I say, hinder growth of fiber optic cables. Because if Google itself, the very large dominant company, the large tech giant, is unable to actually put down fiber optic cable, you can really tell it sends a clear message to other people, be like, hey, considering with our billions of dollars and we can't even get Google Fiber up in these cities, you probably shouldn't try either. So, ISPs, not doing that great with competitive nature here. But that's not even the extent of it. In these situations where they actually do have a competitive, I would say, conflict with Google, I think companies like AT&T do this weird thing where they would, I would say, offer a service that would cost $30 more. That would basically say, hey, we won't track your data if you give us $30 a month, and we won't give you those targeted ads that you see everywhere, which, Windows 10 and Google does it all the time. Instead, now you just won't have AT&T tracking your data. But the fact they had to offer that as a $30 tack on to their already service that was competitive to Google Fiber at the time. So as you can see, they're very reluctant to actually do Google Fiber. And in the cases, they're not afraid to actually eke out a little bit more cash for the sake of actually getting a little bit more. But that's just one aspect. That's just their anti-competitive nature. It doesn't really say specifically what they would do in the case of where net neutrality was specifically fucked over. Because like I said, if you read that entire political article that I reached here, the bill is actually a little bit more comprehensive than just net neutrality itself. Which makes sense, because there's quite a few Obama-era regulations that I imagine Trump would like to get rid of. But in the specific case of net neutrality, there is this very interesting graph that I'm all sure you have learned about. So this is an article back in 2014, but the graph was actually over 2013, and an era where net neutrality wasn't as stiffly upheld. So as you can see, typical improvement over time, ISPs would gradually increase their, how would I say, the internet speeds to Netflix, which makes sense. Netflix over time is slowly becoming more and more dominant, so more and more people would eventually actually invest into it, so the speeds would gradually increase to Netflix. Although if you notice, quite a few of the large brand ISPs for some reason took a dip in their actual performance, and most notably Comcast had this very interesting relationship with Netflix at the time. So what the common theory is suggested is that when Netflix became more popular, Comcast was actually throttling their service. And this actually resulted in millions. You got to remember, Comcast is a very, how would I say, far-reaching company. They have a lot of customers that go and use Netflix, and it uses like what, over half the America's broadband or more at a given time. So a lot of people use it, and it puts a lot of strain on the system. But as you can see, Comcast was actually slowly reducing the speed. But behind closed doors, it was noted that Comcast was actually in talks with Netflix, saying, hey, Netflix, pay us a little cash here, and we'll magically improve our infrastructure overnight. Because you got to remember, it took 6 months for Google Fiber to implement fiber optic cable. So how Comcast was able to somehow flip around and offer really fast internet speeds to Netflix all of a sudden, a little bit suspicious. But as soon as a little bit of cash changed hands there, boom, fucking internet to Comcast, Netflix, totally unhindered. Fucking everything was perfect all of a sudden again. And made a lot of people scratch their heads thinking, hold the fuck on there. Did you just extort Netflix for fucking cash? Now you have to remember, this is Comcast going ballsy against Netflix, which has an assload of cash in their advantage. Imagine what they would do to the average consumer. In fact, you don't even need to know what the fuck they'll actually do to the average consumer, because right now they already do what they're most likely going to do with TV packages and how they have that weird tier system. You know, get these 30 channels for this much money, get these many channels for this much money, get everything for this reduced cost bundle of $700 for all 6,000 channels that you'll never watch. They'll probably do something similar to that, considering it would just be a simple copy and paste of their payment models. So in that case, it's a little bit sketchy to figure out what ISPs will actually do in cases of net neutrality. And if I remember correctly, I believe it was either Portugal or Spain. Wouldn't quote me on this. Grain of salt. ISPs actually did do that tier service. So while it may not be a direct one-on-one comparison, because these are different countries with different rules and regulations, it is very, I would say, easy to, I would say, conclude that ISPs would do something they've done in the past to increase profit margins, because companies naturally want to increase profit margins here without providing extra service. If you can somehow provide, or rather generate more income without actually expending more on upgrading, maintaining, or providing better services, then you kind of want to do that. That makes total sense, and net neutrality basically gives them the free rein to do that. Come on there, Tab, get the fuck out of there. So that is really the big point of contention when it comes to this. If ISPs actually have the ability to regulate, to fiddle around with all this little mumbo-jumbo with net neutrality, then they'll likely do bad things with the net. They'll split it into tiers, they'll reduce speeds, they'll throttle services. And it's not even to consider the insidious things they could do with net neutrality, like Comcast did with Netflix. They can do more insidious shit. They can block content to websites that are opposing these ISPs. So if somebody writes an article about shitty Comcast tactics, they could see that article disappear, or hell, the entire website disappear entirely off that website, from the internet entirely. You can only access it through the dark web, if that's even fucking allowed. But even then, there's more things like the fact that small companies or small little service providers couldn't really compete due to local regulations like that one where they drag their feet like crazy when installing new wires. But even then, it's saying somebody develops a new software, a new website, a new whatever, they could theoretically, ISPs could theoretically charge people to actually access the web. So in cases like that, they could actually reduce the service even more and make it harder, increase the barrier of entry into the online space to begin with. And that's not even delving in. That's a whole bunch of theoreticals that you can learn about through other people who are more well versed with such things, because I only have a cursory knowledge of a lot of these topics. But that's just my take on this whole thing. And I don't know, what do you guys think? You guys think that ISPs can be trusted with maintaining the consumer's interest at heart? If no, then net neutrality should be in place. If you think ISPs can be trusted, all three of them that exist now in the world, or in your case, most likely only one that exists in your area, do you trust him to make sure he keeps your internet nice and pure when he has nothing competing against him? Let me know in the comments down below. And other than that, I believe there's social media links if that's your fancy, and Discord if you want to join the community, as well as get notifications of when I go live and videos, fancy. And other than that, I think I'll leave you there, so thank you all for watching. If you liked the video, make sure to like, and I'll see you next time, guys. Bye-bye.